It's great to be here, and I want to try and persuade you that we need to interact more with the sciences. I want to try and give you a vision of why we should be doing this, to kind of inspire you to go away and say, there's something we need to do, it can be done, it needs to be done. Let me begin with a quote from C.S. Lewis. Lewis once wrote these words, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not just because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And Lewis is there giving us a vision of the double rationality of the Christian faith. It makes sense in itself, but it also makes sense of everything else. And for Lewis, that capacity to make sense of things is an indication of the truth of faith. In other words, Lewis is saying that there is a map of reality, that Christianity is projecting on the screen of reality a map, and somewhere on that map are the natural sciences. The Christian faith has sufficient capaciousness to be able to embrace the natural sciences, to allow us to engage in dialogue with them without fear. And in many ways, that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. Why should we talk more to scientists? Well, one very obvious reason, of course, is that book, The God Delusion, by Richard Dawkins. Because a core theme of that book is that real scientists are not and cannot be Christians. That being a scientist carries with it, as part of its professional responsibility, a disbelief in God. That's a very simple message. And simple messages get heard, and they get acted on. And in many ways, we've got to challenge that. And in challenging it, we're sending out a more complex message. We're saying it's not as simple as that. And that means it's sometimes difficult to get that message across with the sheer efficiency of the soundbite. Science disproves God. What I want to do in this short session is to encourage you to think of how we might do this, realizing how important it is. Richard Dawkins is adamant. Science eliminates any conceptual space that God might once have thought to have occupied. And you know, I used to think that myself. In fact, going back to my school days, I took the view that science showed us there was no God, that those who believed in God were some kind of losers who were just on the way out. And I took a certain grim satisfaction in looking into the future and thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years, these guys who believe in God, they are going to be gone, and there's going to be nobody to replace them. And you know, that's one of the reasons why the new atheism is so angry. Because 40 years have passed and religion hasn't gone away at all. In fact, it seems to have become more influential politically and socially than ever before. And that, I think, helps us understand the anger behind the new atheism. Why are Dawkins and Hitchens so angry? Because everything in their creed said this ought to have died out, and it hasn't. And that's a real challenge, not just pragmatically, but also for their own way of thinking. If your theory says this is going to die out, and it doesn't, then that's not just a practical problem. It's also saying there might be something wrong with your theory as well. When I read Dawkins these days, I kind of get a bit nostalgic. I think that's the way I used to be as well. But what can we do about this? I'm going to make some suggestions. I'm going to talk about ways in which we might begin to interact with the sciences. In other words, we might begin to do some apologetics. And apologetics really is about engaging our culture. And it's got two elements. It's trying to identify what the problems are and working out what we can say to those concerns. And it's also trying to work out how we project, how we communicate, how we commend the Christian faith to our culture. And that means we talk to scientists as well. What are the objections that scientists might raise? Well, they might say something like this, that it's obvious that science just doesn't give God house room. And that's why it's so important we can point to scientists who are religious believers, time just for one, you might think of Francis Collins, who headed up the Human Genome Project before joining Barack Obama's administration. His book, The Language of God, in which he tells how he, as a former atheist who became a Christian, discovered that his Christian faith made far more sense of the scientific enterprise in general and evolutionary biology in particular than his former atheism. We need to encourage and to enable scientists who are religious believers to be able to speak out on these matters and say, you say, believing in God is a no-no for a scientist. I say otherwise. We need to empower these individuals, and very often that means identifying them and building a vision of what they could do, the difference that they could make. So if you're a pastor, I would ask you, who are the scientists in your congregation? What vision could you build with them and for them for the difference that they might make? Or again, a soundbite we're so familiar with from our culture: science proves things. Religion just kind of hopes for the best and crosses its fingers. That may have been true in the year 1850. I don't think it's true today. Because as those of you who are scientists will know, the field is now dominated by what is called inference to the best explanation. It means looking at a mass of observations and saying which of the many possible ways of explaining this actually matches up the best, which gives us the best fit between what the theory says and what we actually observe. And that's how scientists do their business, trying to develop theories which give the best fit for what they observe in the world. Sometimes it's relatively certain, other times it's really not that clear at all. Dawkins argues science proves things with absolute certainty. The reality is very different. But go back to my quote from C.S. Lewis at the very beginning. What's he saying? He's saying that the wonderful thing about the Christian faith is that it makes sense of what we see in the world. And that seems to me to be something we need to hold on to and rejoice in. The intellectual capaciousness of our faith, which helps us make sense of our own lives, but also the world that are around us. So what I say to scientists, there are many things. I want to begin by emphasizing they are not the enemy. They are people we need to talk to, people who we need to bring the gospel to in terms they can understand and which resonate with them. Let me just make some very brief suggestions. One is to begin by making the point that science is incomplete. If you like, it offers us a very superficial way of looking at things. It's a surface reading of the way the world is. Again, going back to Richard Dawkins, those of you who've read his book, River Out of Eden, will know the very famous quote on page 153, where he talks about the universe we observe having exactly the properties we expect. If it has no purpose, no design, there's no good, no evil, there's nothing, he says, but blind, pitiless indifference. It's a great quote, but it's a quote you get by looking at the surface. And in many ways, we need to go deeper. We need to ask, what is nature pointing to? We go back to Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. And we're able to say that in some way, the natural world around us, which science aims to investigate and to represent in terms of mathematical equations, actually has this capacity to point to the glory of the God that created it. And in many ways, the challenge facing all of us here today is to talk to scientists who see the ordering of creation and help them to see the glory of God reflected in that creation. It's not that science is wrong. I'd never say that. But it's that science is incomplete. It needs supplementation. And the really important point, I think, is this. We must never forget that scientists are human beings. They think about the meaning of life. They wonder why they're here. And most of them are very, very clear that science can't answer those questions. Sir Peter Medawar was an Oxford immunologist who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine back in the 1960s. And towards the end of his life, he wrote a little book called The Limits of Science. And in this book, he simply said, science is great in looking at the structures of the world, helping us to make sense of it, but there are a whole range of questions it just can't answer, and that no advance in science would enable it to answer. What sort of questions does he have in mind? Why are we here? What's the point of living? And those are real questions for all of us here. And they're real questions for scientists as well. What I think we need to be able to do is to show how the Christian faith both endorses this quest for order in the natural world. We believe passionately God made this world and made it well, and that the ordering of the world reflects the mind of God. That helps us make sense of the scientific enterprise. But it's also about saying there is something deeper, something further, which must be discovered and made ours before life is transformed. Many of you will know the very famous prayer of Augustine of Hippo, written about the year 401. You have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. Scientists have restless hearts as well. We need to help them come home to God and find that peace. Practically then, what can we do? I want to suggest there are three things that can be done, and there are three things I think can be done especially well by those who are pastors. I'm going to use three words: reassure, encourage, and challenge. Reassure. We need to reassure people of the robustness and resilience of the Christian faith. Here is something that is right. Here is something that is relevant. Here is something that works. In the film clip we heard a few moments ago, you'll notice one character made the point that Christians get nervous when thinking about science. And it's partly because they're worried that chinks in their armor might be exposed by thinking about these things. We need to reassure people that Christianity is right, it's comprehensive, that it draws a map of reality in which the natural sciences are located. It's something we can talk about and engage with without fear. Reassurance. But secondly, encouragement. What I mean by this is we need to encourage people who either are scientists or who are thinking about scientists to see this possibly as a calling that God has laid upon them so that they might be salt and light in a scientific culture. One of our problems is that we need more people who can speak the truth of the gospel with clarity, with conviction, and with compassion inside a scientific culture. And people need to be helped, need to be encouraged to have that vision for their lives. Someone needs to help lay that burden upon them and say, this may be something you could be doing, and it most assuredly is something that needs to be done. It's about vocation. It's about, in effect, saying, will you go into this community and build bridges, speak the word of truth into that context? And that means building a long-term vision for these people's lives. We have many Christians who are scientists. We want them to up their game and see themselves not simply as someone who is present in a scientific culture, but as one who is able to operate as ambassadors for Christ and the Christian faith in those contexts. They'll need support, they'll need encouragement, may I ask you to think about making this something you bring into the ministry of your church? And finally, we need to think about challenging. And by challenging, I mean asking those questions that need to be asked. For example, about Darwinism. Very often scientists will loosely talk about Darwinism, saying it poses a fundamental threat to the Christian faith. You've all heard that. But we need to challenge this. Darwinism can mean many different things. It can mean a provisional scientific theory open to correction like all others about our origins. It can also mean a worldview, something that's been expanded metaphysically, from which God is systematically excluded as a matter of principle. And those of you who've read Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, will know that's the sense in which he uses the word Darwinism. We need to challenge that and say it's not that straightforward, and also we need to reread our own tradition and see if there are resources in that which might help us engage with these issues as we reflect on them today. We live, I very much fear, in a soundbite culture. Science disproves God. Will you please challenge that and say, can I stop you right there? I don't think you really mean that. I'd like to challenge you to justify that assertion. Because I'm going to say to you, it's not right, it's not defensible, and there are things that you can say that will make a big difference in that context. My time is running out. Let me then make the final point as simply as I can. We all know about mission fields. They're important, and we need our best people on them. I want to suggest to you that since the rise of the new atheism, which has made science its weapon against religious belief, there is a new mission field. And basically, it is a scientific culture. What we need to be doing is asking, as a matter of principle and intention, who are the people that we could put in that context to speak with compassion, power, and conviction to make a difference in that context. I want to suggest that there are people who can do that, and we need to think about who they are. But most assuredly, this is something that needs to be done. It needs to be done well, and I think it needs to be done now. Thank you very much for listening.